Have you ever caught yourself mid-sentence and wondered whose words were coming out of your mouth? Have you ever made a decision that felt completely unlike you, only to realize later it was the most authentic thing you'd done in years? What if the person you think you are is nothing more than a carefully constructed performance, and the real you is buried so deep you've forgotten it exists? Carl Jung spent his life excavating the human psyche, and what he found there would disturb most people. He discovered that consciousness is just the tip of an iceberg, and beneath the surface lies a vast, dark ocean of forgotten memories, suppressed desires, and inherited patterns that control us more than we'd ever dare to admit. You wake up each morning and put on a face. Not literally, but psychologically. Jung called this the persona, the mask we wear to navigate the social world. It's the professional you at work, the dutiful child around your parents, the confident friend in your social circle. These masks aren't inherently bad, they're necessary for functioning in society. But the danger comes when you forget they're masks at all. Look at your daily routine. How many of your choices are actually yours? When you choose what to wear, are you expressing your authentic self, or are you calculating what others will think? When you speak in meetings, are you sharing your genuine thoughts, or are you performing the role of someone competent and agreeable? When you post on social media, are you documenting your life or curating an image? The persona becomes a prison when we mistake it for our true identity. We start believing our own performance, thinking that the mask is the face underneath. We become so skilled at being who others expect us to be that we lose track of who we actually are beneath all those expectations. But Jung discovered something even more unsettling. While we're busy perfecting our personas, maintaining our acceptable public faces, everything we reject about ourselves doesn't simply disappear, it goes underground, into what he called the shadow. This isn't some mystical concept, it's psychologically observable and scientifically valid. The shadow is the repository of all the parts of ourselves we've deemed unacceptable. Think about the emotions you were taught were inappropriate as a child. Anger, perhaps, if you grew up in a household where good children don't get angry. Or maybe sadness, if you learned that crying made others uncomfortable. What about ambition, if you were raised to believe that wanting things for yourself was selfish? Or creativity, if you were told that artistic pursuits were impractical? All of these rejected aspects don't disappear, they accumulate in the shadow, growing stronger in the darkness. And from there, they influence your behavior in ways you don't consciously recognize. The anger you never learned to express might emerge as passive aggressiveness or sudden explosive outbursts. The sadness you were taught to suppress might manifest as numbness or an inability to feel joy. The ambition you rejected might show up as self-sabotage whenever you get close to success. The shadow also contains positive qualities we've disowned. Maybe you learned that intelligence made others feel threatened, so you started hiding your insights. Perhaps you discovered that your natural leadership abilities intimidated your peers, so you began playing small. Or you found that your compassion was taken advantage of, so you built walls around your heart. Jung observed that we often recognize our shadow not in ourselves, but in others. The traits that trigger the strongest reactions in us, the behaviors we judge most harshly in other people, are often projections of our own disowned aspects. The person whose arrogance infuriates you might be reflecting your own suppressed confidence. The individual whose neediness annoys you could be mirroring your own unacknowledged dependency. The colleague whose dishonesty disgusts you might be showing you your own capacity for deception. This projection mechanism serves a psychological function. It's easier to see our flaws in others than to acknowledge them in ourselves. It allows us to maintain the illusion that we're good, moral, and in control. But it also keeps us unconscious, reactive, and ultimately unfree. The unconscious mind operates according to its own logic, not the rational principles of consciousness. It communicates through symbols, dreams, slips of the tongue, and emotional reactions we can't explain. It influences our choices through what Jung called complexes, emotionally charged clusters of thoughts and feelings that operate autonomously, like sub-personalities within our psyche. You might have a mother complex that causes you to either rebel against authority or seek approval from older women. You could carry a wounded child complex that makes you oversensitive to criticism or abandonment. Perhaps you have a hero complex that drives you to rescue others at the expense of your own well-being, or a victim complex that keeps you stuck in patterns of powerlessness. These complexes aren't conscious choices, they're psychological structures that formed in response to early experiences and continue to operate outside our awareness. They hijack our rational mind when triggered, causing us to react in ways that don't match our conscious intentions. You might pride yourself on being independent, only to find yourself desperately seeking approval from a boss who reminds you of your father. You might consider yourself emotionally mature, yet find yourself having childlike tantrums when you don't get your way. The tragedy is that most people live their entire lives unconscious of these dynamics. They believe they're making free choices when they're actually being driven by unconscious patterns. They think they know themselves when they only know their persona. They assume they're in control when they're actually being controlled by forces they refuse to acknowledge. Jung called this state of unconsciousness inflation, the ego's grandiose belief that it's in charge. The inflated ego thinks it's the master of the psyche, when in reality it's more like a small boat on a vast ocean, subject to currents and storms it doesn't understand. This inflation leads to what Jung termed enantiodromia, the tendency for things to turn into their opposite when pushed to extremes. The person who tries to be perfectly good becomes capable of unconscious cruelty. The individual who prides themselves on rationality becomes prey to irrational obsessions. The one who seeks absolute control finds their life spiraling into chaos. This isn't moral failure, it's psychological law. What we refuse to acknowledge consciously will eventually express itself unconsciously, often in destructive ways. But Jung didn't present these insights to discourage us. He offered them as a path to genuine freedom. He believed that consciousness could be expanded, that we could learn to recognize and integrate our shadow, that we could develop a more honest and complete relationship with ourselves. This process, which he called individuation, is the psychological equivalent of growing up, not just chronologically, but psychologically and spiritually. Individuation requires courage because it demands that we give up our illusions about ourselves. It asks us to face the parts of our personality we'd rather deny, to acknowledge our capacity for both good and evil, to accept our limitations while also recognizing our potential. It's a lifelong process of becoming more conscious, more integrated, more authentically ourselves. The first step is recognizing that you're not who you think you are. The person you present to the world, the identity you've constructed, the story you tell about yourself, these are just the beginning. Beneath the surface lies a vast, unexplored territory of psyche, filled with both treasures and terrors, both gifts and wounds, both light and shadow. This recognition can be disturbing. It challenges everything you thought you knew about yourself. It suggests that your carefully constructed identity might be a house of cards, that your sense of control might be an illusion, that your understanding of your own motivations might be fundamentally flawed. The ego doesn't like this message. It prefers the comfortable fiction that it's in charge, that it knows what it's doing, that it's basically good and rational and competent. But this disturbance is also an invitation. It's the beginning of a deeper conversation with yourself, one that can lead to greater authenticity, creativity, and freedom. When you stop defending your persona and start exploring your totality, you discover resources you didn't know you had. You find parts of yourself that have been waiting patiently for recognition. You uncover gifts that were buried beneath layers of conditioning and fear. The journey into the unconscious isn't a comfortable one. It requires you to question everything you've taken for granted about yourself. It asks you to sit with uncertainty, to tolerate paradox, to embrace complexity. It demands that you become comfortable with being uncomfortable, that you learn to navigate by inner compass rather than external approval. But for those willing to take this journey, Jung promised something remarkable: the possibility of becoming whole. Not perfect, wholeness includes imperfection. Not pure, wholeness embraces both light and dark. Not simple, wholeness contains contradictions, but complete, authentic, and ultimately free from the tyranny of unconscious patterns. This is the invitation Jung extends to every human being: to wake up from the trance of persona identification, to acknowledge the shadow that follows you everywhere, to recognize the unconscious forces that shape your life, and to begin the difficult but rewarding work of becoming conscious. It's not a path for everyone. It requires a kind of psychological bravery that many people aren't ready for. But for those who are, it offers the possibility of a life lived from the inside out, rather than the outside in. The moment you begin to see through your own illusions, something shifts in the fabric of your reality. It's not a comfortable shift. Jung never promised comfort. He promised truth, and truth has a way of burning through everything false until only what essential remains. You've spent years, perhaps decades, building an identity, constructing a life, creating a story about who you are and what you want. Now you're being asked to question all of it. This questioning isn't abstract philosophy, it's deeply personal, viscerally real. When you start paying attention to your shadow projections, you notice how often you react with disproportionate emotion to other people's behavior. When you begin observing your persona in action, you catch yourself performing roles that feel hollow. When you start listening to your dreams and symptoms, you hear messages from parts of yourself you've been ignoring for years. The process Jung called individuation is essentially a conversation between the conscious and unconscious parts of your psyche. But it's not a polite conversation. The unconscious has been silenced for so long that when it finally gets a chance to speak, it often comes through as crisis, breakdown, depression, anxiety, or what Jung called the dark night of the soul. These psychological crises aren't signs of failure, they're invitations to depth. Your psyche is trying to get your attention, to tell you that the life you've been living is too small for who you actually are. The anxiety you feel might be your authentic self struggling to break free from a career that doesn't fit. The depression could be your soul's response to relationships that require you to betray your true nature. The restlessness might be your creative spirit demanding expression after years of being practical and responsible. But here's what makes this process so challenging. Our culture doesn't support individuation. Society needs people to play their roles, to be predictable, to fit into systems and structures. The economy depends on people being good consumers. Institutions rely on people following rules without asking too many questions. Families often function better when everyone stays in their assigned positions. Individuation threatens all of this. When you start becoming who you actually are, rather than who you're supposed to be, you become less controllable, less predictable, less willing to sacrifice your authenticity for others' comfort. You start making choices based on your inner authority rather than external expectations. You begin saying no to things that don't align with your values, even when saying no disappoints people you care about. This is why Jung emphasized that individuation is fundamentally a solitary journey. You can't individuate by committee. You can't become yourself by consensus. At some point, you have to be willing to stand alone with your own truth, even when that truth is uncomfortable or inconvenient for others. The shadow work that Jung pioneered isn't about eliminating your dark side, it's about developing a conscious relationship with it. When you deny your capacity for anger, that anger doesn't disappear. It goes underground and emerges as passive aggressiveness, resentment, or sudden explosions. When you refuse to acknowledge your selfishness, you become unconsciously manipulative, taking what you need through indirect means rather than honest assertion. But when you can own your anger consciously, it becomes a source of healthy boundaries and authentic power. When you can acknowledge your selfishness, it transforms into healthy self-care and the ability to meet your own needs without guilt. When you can admit your envy, it becomes motivation to pursue what you actually want, rather than pretending you're above desire. This integration process requires what Jung called holding the tension of the opposites. Instead of choosing between being good or bad, kind or fierce, independent or connected, you learn to contain both polarities within yourself. You become more complex, more nuanced, more human. You stop trying to be a saint and start trying to be whole. The individuation process typically unfolds in stages, though they're not linear. First comes the recognition that you're not who you thought you were. This can be terrifying, like losing your moorings in a storm. Everything you used to be certain about becomes questionable. Your values, your relationships, your career choices, your lifestyle, all of it comes under scrutiny from your emerging, authentic self. Next comes the shadow work, the slow, often painful process of reclaiming the parts of yourself you've disowned. This might involve acknowledging your anger, your neediness, your ambition, your sexuality, your creativity, your vulnerability, or your strength. Each reclaimed aspect brings both power and responsibility. You can no longer pretend you don't have these capacities, which means you can no longer avoid the choices that come with them. Then comes what Jung called the encounter with the anima or animus, the contrasexual aspect of your psyche. For men, this often means learning to access their emotional, intuitive, receptive qualities. For women, it might involve claiming their assertive, analytical, goal-oriented nature. This isn't about becoming less masculine or less feminine, but about becoming more complete as a human being. As the process deepens, you begin to encounter what Jung called the self, the archetypal image of wholeness that exists within every human psyche. The self isn't your ego. It's much larger than your personal identity. It's the organizing principle that can hold all your contradictions, integrate all your aspects, and guide you toward your unique destiny. This encounter with the self often brings a profound shift in values and priorities. Things that once seemed desperately important, status, approval, security, being right, begin to matter less. What starts to matter more is authenticity, meaning, service, love, and the expression of your unique gifts. You become less concerned with how you appear to others and more interested in whether you're being true to your deepest nature. But this transformation comes with losses. You might lose relationships that were based on your old persona. You might need to leave career paths that no longer fit. You might have to disappoint people who preferred the version of you that was more convenient for them. You might need to give up the illusion that you can please everyone or control how others perceive you. These losses are real, and they need to be grieved. Jung understood that individuation requires a kind of death, the death of the false self, the death of childhood illusions, the death of the fantasy that you can live without contradiction or conflict. This psychological death is necessary for psychological rebirth, but it's still a death. And death's hurt. What emerges from this process isn't a perfect person, it's a real person. Someone who can own their full humanity without shame or grandiosity. Someone who can love without losing themselves. Who can be alone without being lonely. Who can act from their deepest values even when it's difficult or unpopular. The individuated person develops what Jung called psychological differentiation, the ability to distinguish between their own thoughts and feelings and those that belong to others. The way they become less susceptible to emotional contagion, less likely to take on other people's problems as their own, more capable of maintaining their center in the midst of chaos. They also develop what might be called emotional resilience, not because they feel less, but because they can feel more fully without being overwhelmed. They've learned to surf the waves of their own emotional life rather than being crushed by them. They understand that feelings, no matter how intense, are temporary visitors, not permanent residents. Perhaps most importantly, individuated people develop a different relationship with suffering. They don't seek it out, but they don't run from it either. They understand that pain is often the psyche's way of getting our attention, that crisis can be the doorway to growth, that what we resist often contains what we most need to learn. This doesn't make them masochistic or passive. Rather, it makes them wise. They know that life includes both joy and sorrow, both success and failure, both connection and solitude. They don't waste energy trying to eliminate the difficult aspects of human existence. Instead, they learn to move through difficulties with grace, to extract meaning from suffering, to find gifts in their wounds. The individuated person also develops what Jung called active imagination, the ability to dialogue consciously with the unconscious through dreams, fantasies, creative expression, and inner work. They become students of their own psyche, curious about their patterns, interested in their symptoms, willing to learn from their mistakes and their successes. This inner work becomes a lifelong practice because individuation isn't a destination, it's a way of being. There's always more to discover, more to integrate, more ways to become more fully yourself. The process continues until death, and perhaps beyond, if you believe in the soul's continuation. What Jung offered wasn't a cure for the human condition. He offered a way to live more consciously within that condition. He showed us that we don't have to be victims of our unconscious patterns, that we can develop a more mature relationship with our psyche, that we can learn to collaborate with the forces within us rather than being controlled by them. This is the promise of Jungian psychology. Not happiness, but wholeness. Not perfection, but integration. Not the elimination of suffering, but the transformation of suffering into wisdom. Not the achievement of a final state of enlightenment, but the ongoing process of becoming more conscious, more authentic, more fully human. The path isn't easy, and it's not for everyone. It requires a willingness to question everything, to face uncomfortable truths, to sit with uncertainty, to take responsibility for your own psychological development. It asks you to give up the comfortable fiction that someone else is responsible for your happiness or unhappiness, that external circumstances determine your inner state, that you're a victim of forces beyond your control. But for those willing to take this path, Jung promised something invaluable: the possibility of living from your own center, of acting from your own authority, of loving from your own heart. The possibility of becoming who you actually are, rather than who you think you should be. The possibility of freedom, not from the human condition, but within it. This is your invitation, not to fix yourself, because you're not broken, not to perfect yourself, because perfection is an illusion, but to know yourself, to accept yourself, to become yourself more fully, to have the courage to be disliked for who you are, rather than loved for who you're not. To trust that your authentic self, with all its flaws and contradictions, is worth more than any persona you could construct. The journey begins with a single step: the willingness to look honestly at yourself, to question your assumptions, to consider the possibility that there's more to you than meets the eye. From there, the path unfolds naturally, guided by your own psyche's wisdom, supported by your own growing consciousness, sustained by your own deepening commitment to truth. Jung spent his life mapping this territory of the human soul. He left us guideposts, not rigid rules. The actual journey is yours to take, in your own way, at your own pace, according to your own unique nature. The only requirement is courage, the courage to meet yourself fully, to embrace your totality, to become who you were born to be.